Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the papacy and the modern world, moving into the reign of Pope 246, Clement XII, who reigned from 1730 to 1740. The conclave of 1730 dragged on for 4 months without reaching agreement. They did not want another Zalante like Benedict XIII, whose personal holiness, while undeniable, nevertheless did not prevent him from neglecting many of his papal duties. Nor did they want a pope who was so worldly that he would negotiate away the Church's independence out of a wish to be accepted by European royalty. They wanted someone between those two extremes, and it took them 4 months to decide who that was. In the end, they elected a moderate Zalante, what we would say conservative, moderate conservative, who did have diplomatic experience as nuncio to Vienna, Austria. He came from a ridiculously wealthy merchant family, lived in a palace on the Piazza Navona, so it was thought that he would be above any need to embezzle money, and that he would have an understanding of money that was desperately needed to correct the disastrous state of affairs left by his predecessor's corrupt the two cardinals, the two Nicolos that he put in charge. Added to that, despite his personal wealth and privilege, his personal morality was beyond reproach. He never took a lover or a concubine, no illegitimate children, and he was always very generous to those in need. The only reason he was not elected sooner was that he was 79 years old and in poor health. But in the end, the conclave put aside those concerns and convinced him to put aside his own concerns about that. And he accepted election on April 7th. He accepted election on July 12th, 1730. His baptismal name was Lorenzo Corsini, not Orsini, Corsini, Corsini. He was born in Florence on April 7th, 1652. He reigned for nearly a decade as Pope 246 under the papal title Clement XII. The cardinals got what they wanted, but not necessarily in the way they wanted it. Clement's first action was to limit the authority of the cardinals, to engage in the abuses of the previous reign of the two Nicolos. On January 10th, 1731, Clement XII issued an apostolic constitution limiting the access cardinals had to the financial management of the Holy See when the Pope was absent from Rome or during an interregnum, a sede vacante, when there was no Pope. He then moved to the pressing need to restore economic stability as well as administrative coherence after Benedict XIII's unworthy cardinals, the two, well, not all of them, but just those two that he put in charge of the administration, reduced the papal states to complete economic ruin. First, to make things clear, that he was changing, Clement had the two Nicolos arrested and put on trial for embezzlement, theft, and simony. They were convicted, and they were sentenced to the confiscation of their estates and 10 years in prison. Next, to restore a flow of revenue and jobs, Clement made Ancona, that's the eastern coast, the Adriatic coast of Italy, which was part of the papal state, made Ancona a free port, duty-free port, meaning no taxes on, thereby luring business away from Venice and getting them to use a port in the papal state. Within a few years, the economy had turned around in the papal state, and the economic hardships were forgotten. In terms of external affairs, this is a period of dynastic warfare, so another one started in his reign, the War of the Polish Succession, 1733 to 1738. This was another of the continual dynastic wars created by the intermarriage of European royalty. In this case, the prize was the throne of Poland. But seen on another level, it was a continuation of the Franco-Austrian conflict, now the Bourbon-Habsburg conflict, that had been a recurring theme for centuries, literally centuries, of Western history. The details of this 5-year-long war are not relevant to papal history except in regard to Italy, which was the scene of some of the fighting. When dynasties fought, all their territories came up for grabs, which put into play Milan and Tuscany north of the Papal States, as well as Naples south of the Papal States. It is of interest that the Pope did not make any offer to mediate this dispute, as so many popes did in previous wars, and he did not take sides. Instead, he did not declare neutrality. He did not formally take sides, nor did he offer to negotiate a settlement. Instead, he made money for the Papal States by selling wine and other supplies, not weapons, but other supplies, to all sides in the armies, north and south of his territory. So morally questionable, perhaps, certainly not heroic. But the conclave got what they wanted, that a pope who would restore stability and take care of business. In the war, the Habsburgs lost, meaning that the Spanish Bourbons once again gained control of all the contested territories in Italy, both north and south of the Papal State, while the French regained control of Alsace-Lorraine, the border between Germany and France that they fought over since Charlemagne died. In the midst of these commercial endeavors, Clement XII did not neglect his teaching office as Pope. He enters history as the first Pope to condemn Freemasonry. The document was an apostolic constitution in eminenti, promulgated on April 28, 1738. So there's some background is required for this. Historically, guilds of Masons are recorded in most of the countries of Europe, which developed along the process we discussed regarding the formation of universities in the medieval course. Medieval stonemasons claimed as their patron St. Reinhold, a 10th century Benedictine, and as their patroness St. Barbara, a 4th century martyr. In England, the relevant country regarding the invention of Freemasonry, these guilds of Masons were suppressed during the Protestant movement because they were considered Catholic confraternities, which they were. In the Middle Ages, that's what they were. The legal abolition of all guilds, not just the Masons, but all guilds in England, occurred during the reign of Edward VI in 1547. That was one of the times of Calvinist ascendancy in England. So those are the actual guilds of medieval stonemasons. However, the movement of Freemasonry is an entirely different phenomenon from the medieval craft guilds. And Freemasonry, 18th century Freemasonry would have been unrecognizable to a real 12th century stonemason. Freemasonry was the creation of the Enlightenment, and part of the anti-religious reaction against the 30 Years' War. Freemasonry was a blending of several pre-existing European institutions, but within this Enlightenment 18th century context. Freemasonry was a fraternal organization. However, it claimed descent, it claimed continuity with the medieval guilds of stonemasons. As such, it retained some rituals and some titles which they asserted had medieval antecedents. But in its Enlightenment form, its 18th century form, Freemasonry was not a guild of skilled workers who actually made their living as stonemasons. Instead, it was a club for gentlemen, people who certainly did not have to work with their hands for a living. And they met periodically for socializing, for intellectual and political discourse, book club kind of things. And it did because of its, claiming continuity with medieval confraternities. It had rituals of initiation. It had secret recognition signals, which only the members knew. It had an internal stratified hierarchy, all of which was secret to outsiders. It was only revealed to the initiated. And then there were different levels. So just those who were initially initiated did not know everything. With each step up, then they got more knowledge. So it's very Gnostic in that sense, the secret knowledge. Okay, that's the conceptual background. Now, in terms of historically connecting the dots of activity. 4 such clubs, which they call themselves lodges, came together for a joint meeting at the Apple Tree Tavern in London on June 24th, 1717, at which they decided to form a union called the Grand Lodge of London. And in doing so, that can be taken as a datable origin, datable beginning of modern Freemasonry as a movement, as a social movement. Initially a social movement. Later it took on political overtones, especially in other countries. These 4 lodges, the membership of these 4 lodges was 100% Englishmen. They were all officially members of the Anglican Church because that was the established church in England. Yet they also were educated men, educated in the 18th century sense of rationalism, that they all accepted the assertions of 18th century rationalism, which we covered earlier. As such, they believed that the ideal manner for a person to conduct his life was a blending of Christian ethics with Enlightenment deism. So they frequently promoted humanitarian causes, charitable causes, which did provided real benefit. And they did it in the name of what they refer to as the brotherhood of man. Capitalized. That's a proper noun, the way they used it, the brotherhood of man. Yet, in terms of theology, they replaced Christian metaphysics with Enlightenment deism. And we covered that earlier, but to refresh your memories, that deism is the assertion that the creation of the physical universe was the work of a being, of a supernatural being, like Plato's prime mover or Aristotle's first cause. But the creator was like a watchmaker. They even use that image, creating the mechanism of the universe that had laws, consistent internal laws to function, but then close the watch, close the clock, and just let it run according to its internal laws. So no longer does the creative prime mover intervene in the mechanism. Now they used the image of the watchmaker and clockmaker, but that was a general Enlightenment deism term. The Freemasons specifically referred to that entity as the Great Architect. And so you see in Freemason symbols the compass and the square with a G in the middle, so that the Great Architect. This Great Architect created the world with internally consistent natural laws, created human beings with a natural law inside of them and reason to guide them, and then just left it to unfold in whatever way the interaction created momentum. As it endured, Freemasonry concocted a mythology for itself. The first leaders of the Grand Lodge were 2 Anglican priests, John Anderson and John Desgouliers. It's English, but it's a French name, but he was descended from the Normans. So Desagulers. Desagoules. Those 2 explained that Freemasons were descended from the craftsmen that built King Solomon's temple, whose services were purchased by the Kingdom of Israel from King Hiram of Tyre. They passed on their secrets for all subsequent centuries, becoming religious, more religious, overtly religious, when they accepted refugee Knights Templar after the order was suppressed in 1312 by the first Avignon Pope, Clement V. And then rituals and stories were concocted, and they accreted over the centuries. Now, just as the Enlightenment ethos took on many forms in different countries, so also did Freemasonry. Some of them, especially in England, were great philanthropists and humanitarians that did genuine good, and there's no reason to try to take that away from them. However, many were also active in politics of all persuasions. In American history, 9 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Masons. 14 U.S. presidents were Masons, including George Washington, the first one. In countries outside of England, the Freemasonry movement spread, but as it cloned and within those different contexts, in other countries, it often became militantly anti-religious and militantly political, and sworn enemies of the Catholic Church. So in France, Voltaire was a Freemason. In the United States, it's said that Nathan Bedford Forrest founded the KKK and that he was a Mason. In the violent, anti-authoritarian, anti-Catholic political category of Freemasonry must be placed the French version, which came into existence in 1728, calling itself the Grand Orient of France. Unlike the French form of Freemasonry, which declared its belief in a supreme being, the great architect, and an afterlife, the French version accepted atheists and was far more politically active in opposition to the monarchy and the established Catholic Church of France. But much of that was in the future. For the time being, Clement XII became the first of 8 popes to formally condemn Freemasonry. In condemning it, Clement was condemning the rationalism of the Enlightenment. From his perspective, he did not have the ability to see the Enlightenment as a period in history, as we can, because he was living through it. He knew from life, just living in it, that there were clear currents in publications and speeches promoting rationalism, naturalism, secret oaths, indifferentism, and national church ecclesiology. At the time of the first condemnation in 1738, Freemasonry was the only identifiable organization embodying Enlightenment beliefs and those beliefs. So in condemning that organization, Clement also condemned those beliefs as well. The 1917 Code of Canon Law included an automatic excommunication for any Catholic who became a Freemason. The Code of Canon Law was revised in 1983 and shortened the list of offenses that lead to an automatic excommunication, and one of those removed was this. So on the list of automatic excommunications, joining the Freemasons was not in the 1983 code. So there were questions that, okay, now is it permitted or not? So that prompted a clarification in the same year, 1983. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, led at the time by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope himself, in a declaration of the CDF dated November 26, 1983, included the following statement, quote, The Church's negative position on Masonic associations therefore remains unaltered, since their principles have always been regarded as irreconcilable with Church doctrine. Hence, joining them remains prohibited by the Church. Catholics enrolled in Masonic associations are involved in serious sin and may not approach Holy Communion. End quote. So essentially, when he says not reconcilable, their theology, it's like they don't believe in the Trinity. The great architect is not a Trinitarian God. Essentially it's a different religion. So just as the Church, we do not give communion to those of other religions because they're not in communion with us. So then, it would be, it would be nonsensical to give communion to Masons who don't even believe in the same God. Even if they say they do, they don't. The great architect is not a Trinitarian deity. So this is not to condemn the charitable work and the humanitarian work that Freemasons do. I mean, good action does not cease to be good action just because it's done by people outside of the Church. But just the teaching is Catholics, we believe in the Trinity because that's what's revealed in the Bible. Jesus used the terms Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But the great architect of the Freemasons is not Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. All right. Other developments. Pope Clement XII made a historic contribution to the art of Rome, not sacred art, but public art, by holding a competition to create a fountain at the juncture of three roads, Trevi, or Trevi, and that's what gave the fountain its name, the Trevi Fountain, 1732, with a little piazza around it. The fountain is at the terminus of an ancient Roman aqueduct, the Aqua Virgo, which had supplied water to the baths of Agrippa, a famous admiral who served Augustus, the first emperor. During the Middle Ages, the engineering skill to repair the aqueducts was largely disappeared, as happened to so many other Roman aqueducts. But early Renaissance popes had rebuilt, the recovered engineering skill of the day, rebuilt some of these aqueducts, and Clement decided to make his contribution with this one, to rebuild that aqueduct to supply a fountain. But as we saw with previous popes, the fountains were practical in the sense it brought clean drinking water, but it also, because of the time period, they wanted it to be beautiful. So it was also a work of art. The competition was won by Nicola Salvi. He started work, but it was not completed till long after Clement died, but it is still there. And of course, I'm sure you've all heard or saw the movie, toss a coin in the fountain, and then that guarantees that one day you'll return to Rome. No. Clement XII died on February 6th, 1740, after a reign of 9 years and 7 months. It was followed by the 18-year reign of Benedict XIV. And we will turn to him in the next video. So for now, thank you for your attention. The session is adjourned.